Good evening. Today I'd like to talk to you about literary theory, and basically I'd like to present an overview of what is literary theory. Now, this is part of your MEG 5, which is the course on literary criticism and theory, and it's the first compulsory course in your second year of MA English. Now, literary theory in a very strict sense is the systematic study of the nature of literature and of the methods of analyzing literature. That's one way of putting it. Now, however, literary scholarship since the 19th century has often included, in addition to, or even instead of literary theory in the strict sense of the term, it has included considerations of intellectual history, moral philosophy, social prophecy, and other interdisciplinary themes. Now, particularly in the humanities, the latter style of scholarship is often simply called theory. And as a consequence, the word theory has become more of an umbrella term for a variety of scholarly approaches to essentially reading texts. Now, many of these approaches are informed by various strands of continental philosophy. Having said that, I'd also like to share a few things on literary theory and literature with you. Now, many contemporary theorists and literary scholars, they believe either that literature, okay, in quotes, literature, cannot be defined, or that it can refer to any use of language. So what we are really trying to say is, one, that we cannot define what is literature, okay, and the other group of thinkers believe that any use of language, be it in medical literature, be it in literature, psychoanalytical literature, or literature as literature per se, all of that comes under the term literature. Now, specific theories are distinguished not only by their methods and conclusions, but even by how they define a text. And once again, even text is in quotes. For some scholars of literature, text comprises little more than books belonging to the Western literary canon. Okay? Some scholars of literature would not consider anything that is written anywhere else apart from the West, and especially in canons. Now, what are canons? Those are established names of writers, of the works in that has been studied over a long period of time. So anything that is not a literary text or a book which belongs to the Western literary canon is not acceptable to many scholars as a text. So what we are trying to say really is that if there are novels from, say, India, or say from Australia, or any diasporic writings, or from South Asian writings, anything at all would not really qualify as text for some scholars. And those are the scholars who believe and who have very, very firm faith in the Western established literary canon. But the principles and methods of literary theory have been applied to non-fiction, popular fiction, film, historical documents, law, advertising, and a number of things, all in the related field of cultural studies. Now, in fact, some scholars within cultural studies treat cultural events such as fashion or football riots as texts to be interpreted. Now, by this measure, literary theory can be thought of as the general theory of interpretation. So what we're trying to tell you now is that it is not just the written word. It is not just a novel from a Western literary canon, but for people engaged particularly in cultural studies, anything can form a text. It could be a movie or a film, it could be a historical document, an archival information, it could be it could be law, it could be advertising, it could even be a fashion show or even a football riot. All of this can be interpreted as text, okay, in quotes. So basically what we're trying to tell you is that literary theory is actually nothing but the general theory of interpretation. It's how you interpret your data, which in this case is your text. Since theorists of literature often draw on a very heterogeneous tradition of continental philosophy and the philosophy of language, any classification of the approaches is but only an approximation. There are many schools or types of literary theory which take different approaches to understanding texts, And most theorists, even among those I'll be mentioning in a while, what they do is they combine methods from more than one of these approaches. Now, for example, I'll tell you, the deconstructive approach of somebody like Paul de Man draws on a long tradition of close reading, which was in fact pioneered by the new critics. And Paul de Man himself was trained in the European hermeneutic tradition. So what is happening here is, even somebody who is somebody like Paul de Man, what is happening is he is drawing on two different approaches. One was the close reading, which was propagated by the new critics, and two, he had his original training in European hermeneutic tradition. So what you're doing is you're combining two methods of interpreting a text. Now, broad schools of theory that have historically been important include the new criticism, formalism, Russian formalism, and structuralism, poststructuralism, Marxism, feminism, and French feminism, Christian postcolonialism, new historicism, deconstruction, reader response criticism, and psychoanalytical criticism. Now let's go back a little further and look at the history of literary theory. The practice of literary theory became a profession only in the 20th century. But as far as its historical background or its historical roots go, it runs as far back as ancient Greece, when we had people like Plato and Aristotle. For instance, if you look at Aristotle's Poetics, it is very often cited as a very early example of literary theory. And then if you turn towards Rome, ancient Rome, you had Longinus's essay on the sublime and Horace's Ars Poetica, or the art of poetry. And you also, not only that, but you also had the aesthetic theories of philosophers from ancient philosophy down to the 18th and the 19th centuries. And these are all very important influences on current literary study. So basically, the theory and criticism of literature is, of course, also very, very closely tied to the history of literature. Now, the modern sense of literary theory, however, the way we use literary theory now, dates only to approximately the 1950s. And that too, why the 1950s? Because that was around the time when the structuralist linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure, who was a Swiss, began strongly to influence English language literary criticism. Now, the new critics and various European-influenced formalists, particularly the Russian formalists, I'll be telling you what and who the formalists were and what the Russian formalists were. Now, the new critics and various European-influenced formalists had described some of their more abstract efforts as theoretical. Now, they're describing themselves, okay? But it was not until the broad impact of structuralism began to be felt in the English-speaking world that literary theory was thought of as a unified domain. In the academic world of the United Kingdom and the United States, literary theory was at its most popular from the late 1960s, when its influence was beginning to spread outward from elite universities such as Johns Hopkins and Yale, and it spread through the 1980s, by which time it was taught nearly everywhere in some form or the other. Now, during this span of time, which was basically from the 1960s to the 1980s, or more or less 2 decades, literary theory was perceived as academically cutting-edge research, and most university literature departments sought to teach and study theory and incorporate it into their curricula. Now, because of its meteoric rise in popularity and the difficult language of its key texts, theory was also often criticized as faddish or trendy obscuranticism, and many academic satire novels of the period, such as those written by David Lodge, feature theory prominently. Now, some scholars, both theoretical and anti-theoretical, refer to the 1970s and the 1980s debates on the academic merits of theory as what they call the theory wars. So essentially what we're trying to do today is basically look at what we mean by when we use the term literary theory. And for that we went back, what we said was that literary theory per se, the way the term is used now is more of a practice that came into prevalence in the 1950s. But of course, historically, it goes way back to classical criticism, or the classical period, where you have Aristotle's Poetics and Longinus's On the Sublime, and Horace's Ars Poetica, or the art of poetry. But it really becomes literary theory with the work of the structuralists, linguistic structuralists, Ferdinand de Saussure. And then, of course, you have the influence of the new critics and various European-influenced formalists. And then in the academic world of United Kingdom and United States, literary theory becomes very, very popular in the 1960s, and that was basically because its influence began to spread outwards from the universities of Yale and Johns Hopkins, and it went right through to the 1980s, by which time it was being taught in some form or the other in all universities in these two countries. And now, by the early 1990s, the popularity of theory as such, as a subject of interest by itself, was declining slightly, even as the texts of literary theory were incorporated into the study of almost all literature. So there were two things happening in the early 90s. One, the popularity of theory as a subject of study or of interest was declining, but at the same time, the texts of literary theory were being incorporated into the curricula of almost all literatures. As of 2004, the controversy over the use of theory in literary studies has all but died out, and discussions on the topic within literary and cultural studies tend now to be considerably milder and less acrimonious. Okay? Some scholars draw heavily on theory in their work, while others only mention it in passing or not at all, but it is an acknowledged important part of the study of literature. So what we're trying to say basically is, while some of people or some scholars, some academic scholars might use theory very, very heavily in their works, others may just mention it in passing, or they may not talk about it at all. But all said and done, whether we use it or we don't, theory has come to stay, and it is an important part of the study of literature. Now, as I already told you in the beginning, there are various strands of in the study of theory, and there are differences among these different schools of thought. And the intellectual traditions and priorities of the various kinds of literal theory are often radically different. Even finding a set of common terms to compare them can be quite difficult at times. For instance, the work of the new critics often contains an implicit moral dimension, and sometimes even a religious connotation. So a new critic might read a poem by T.S. Eliot, or say Gerald Manley Hopkins, and the way he interprets it or she interprets it would be for its degree of honesty in expressing the torment and contradiction of a serious search for belief in the modern world. Okay? While the same poem by the same poet could be looked upon by a Marxist critic as, who might find these judgments merely ideological rather than critical, and the Marxist critic would say that the new critical reading did not keep enough critical distance from the poem's religious stance to be able to really understand it. Or if the same poem is read by a PostStructuralist critic, he might or she might simply avoid the issue by understanding the religious meaning of a poem as an allegory of meaning, treating the poem's references to God by discussing their referential nature rather than what they actually refer to. So what we're basically trying to say is that a poem by a particular poet can be read by practitioners of different schools of criticism, and each one would have their own interpretation. Now, such a disagreement cannot really be resolved easily, because it is inherent in the radically different terms and goals, that is, the theories of the critics. Their theories of reading derive from vastly different intellectual traditions. For instance, the new critic bases his or her work on an East Coast American scholarly and religious tradition, while the Marxist derives his or her thought from a body of critical social and economic thought. And the post-structuralist work emerges from 20th century continental philosophy of language. And to really expect these different approaches to have much in common is actually a very, very naive thing to do. So calling them all theories of literature without really acknowledging their heterogeneity is itself a reduction of their differences. Now, in the late 1950s, Canadian literary critic Andrew Costigan, he attempted to establish an approach for reconciling historical criticism and new criticism while addressing concerns of early reader response and numerous psychological and social approaches. So what he was trying to do is bring together 4 different strands of criticism: historical criticism, new criticism, reader response theory, psychological and social approaches. And his approach is laid out in his Anatomy of Criticism, is explicitly structuralist. It relies on the assumption of an intertextual order of words and universality of certain structural types. Now his approach, this particular approach that he adopted, it held sway in English literature programs for several decades, but lost favor during the ascendance of post-structuralism. For some theories of literature, especially certain kinds of formalism, the distinction between literary and other sorts of texts is of paramount importance. Now, the formalists, for them, the distinction between what they consider to be literary and text and any other text is very, very important and very, very crucial to their theorizing. Other schools, particularly post-structuralism in its various forms, which could include new historicism, deconstruction, some strands of Marxism, and even feminism, they have sought to break down the distinctions between the two and have applied the tools of textual interpretation to a wide range of texts in quotes, which include film, non-fiction, historical writing, and even cultural events. Now, Costigan argued that in what he calls, the utter inadequacy of literary theory is evident when it is forced to deal with the novel. Now, he finds literary theory utterly inadequate when you're talking or dealing with the novel. And he says that while other genres are intact, already stabilized, the novel is still young and developing. So that's when he feels that literary theory is utterly inadequate to deal with the novel as a genre. Another crucial distinction among the various theories of literary interpretation is intentionality, the amount of weight that is given to the author's own opinions about and intentions for a particular work. For most pre-20th century approaches, the author's intentions are a guiding factor and an important determiner of the correct interpretation of texts. The new criticism was the first school to disavow the role of the author in interpreting texts, and they preferred to focus on the text itself in a close reading. So in fact, as much contention as there is, between formalism and later schools, they do share the tenet that the author's interpretation of a work is no more inherently meaningful than any other interpretation or any other reading. Now I'll tell you about the different schools of literary theory and their major authors. Now, in many cases, you have to remember, particularly in the case of the historian and philosopher Michel Foucault and the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, the authors were not primarily literary critics, but their work has been broadly influential in literary theory. Now, the first of the schools is American pragmatism and other American approaches. Now, what is pragmatic criticism? Pragmatic criticism is a type of criticism that goes back to the Roman poet Horace, who in his Ars Poetica, or the art of poetry, which is a 1st century BC work, emphasized the effect of a literary work on its audience. Now, in Ars Poetica, what Horace was saying is that you have to judge the merit of a literary work based on the kind of effect it has on its audience. So pragmatic critics, they take it up from there, and they believe that authors structure works in such a way as to attain specific effects on and elicit certain responses from the reader or the audience. Now, these critics thus evaluate a work based on their perception of the success or failure of that work or the author to achieve its objectives. And the chief exponents of American pragmatism and other American approaches are Harold Bloom, Stanley Fish, and Richard Rorty. The next school is the cultural studies. Okay, now cultural studies in Great Britain. The term, in Great Britain, what was happening is the terms cultural criticism and cultural studies have been used more or less interchangeably. And not only is it being used interchangeably, it also adds to the, it adds to the confusion. Why? Because both terms have been used to refer to two different things. So, what they're doing in Great Britain, as far as cultural studies is concerned, is that they're using the terms cultural criticism and cultural studies interchangeably. And B, at the same time, what is happening is that these two terms, cultural criticism and cultural studies, is being used to refer to two different things. On the one hand, they have been used to refer to the analysis of literature and other art forms in their social, political, or economic contexts, and on the other hand, they have been used to refer to the much broader interdisciplinary study of the interrelationships between a variety of cultural discourses and practices, such as advertising, gift-giving, and racial categorization. But in North America, the term cultural studies is usually reserved for this broader analysis, whereas cultural criticism typically refers to work with a predominantly literary or artistic focus. So essentially what cultural studies does is emphasize the role of literature in everyday life. And you have people like Raymond Williams, Dick Hebdegay, and Stuart Hall, who is the chief propounder of British cultural studies, Max Horkheimer and Theodore Adorno, Michel de Certeau, Paul Gilroy, and John Guillory. And the other school of thought is the comparative literature one. Okay, now comparative literary criticism is the critical scholarship which deals with the literature of two or more different linguistic, cultural, or national groups. While most frequently practiced with works of different languages, it may also be performed on works of the same language if the works originate from different nations or cultures among which that language is spoken. Also included in the range of inquiry are comparisons of different types of art. For example, a comparatist might investigate the relationship of film to, say, literature. And the people... Then you also have the Devonian literary studies, okay, which situates literature in the context of evolution and natural selection. Then the school of deconstructionist. Now, deconstruction involves the close reading of texts in order to demonstrate that any given text has irreconcilably contradictory meanings rather than being a unified logical whole. So what you're saying is, what deconstruction does is it reads a text very, very closely in order to look at how it has contradictory meanings and that it is not a single unified logical whole. Deconstruction was both created and has been profoundly influenced by the French philosopher of language Jacques Derrida. And Derrida, who coined the term deconstruction, argues that in Western culture, people tend to think and express their thoughts in terms of binary oppositions. So something is white, why, but not black. Something is masculine and therefore not feminine, and is a cause rather than an effect. Now, deconstruction is a strategy of close reading that elicits the ways that key terms and concepts may be paradoxical or self-undermining, rendering their meaning undecidable. And the chief critics of deconstruction are Jacques Derrida, Paul de Man, J. Hillis Miller, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, Gayatri Spivak, and Avital Ronell. Now let's look at gender. Okay, the school of gender criticism. Gender criticism is essentially a type of literary criticism that focuses on and critiques gender as it commonly is conceived, seeking to expose its insufficiency as a categorizing device. Gender critics reject the view that gender is something natural, that men are or should be masculine, women feminine, and that any other alignment is abnormal. So with gender, basically what it does is it emphasizes themes of gender relations, and you have people like Lucy Irigaray, Helen Sisu, and Elaine Showalter, who follow the school of gender thought, or who might be looked upon as feminist literary critics. Now, formalism. What is formalism? Formalism is a general term covering several similar types of literary criticism that arose in the 1920s and the 1930s, and it flourished during the 1940s and 50s, and is still in evidence today. Formalists see the literary work as an object in its own right. Thus, they tend to devote their attention to its intrinsic nature rather than to the kind of external matters mentioned before, and they concentrate their analysis on the interplay and relationships between the text's essential verbal elements. They study the form of the work as opposed to the content, and although form to a formalist could mean or could connote anything from genre to grammatical or rhetorical structures. And along with the formalists, you also have the German Hermeneutics and the School of Philology, and the chief exponents of this school of thought are Friedrich Schleiermacher, William Dilthey, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Erich Auerbach. As far as Marxism or Marxist literary criticism is concerned, it emphasizes themes of class conflict, and you have people like George Lukács, Valentin Voloshanov, Raymond Williams, Terry Eagleton, Frederick Jameson, Theodore Adorno, and Walter Benjamin. Now, in New Criticism, what New Criticism does is it looks at literary works on the basis of what is written and not at the goals of the author or the biographical issues. And you have people like W.K. Wimsatt, F.R. Leavies, John Crowe Ransom, Cleanth Brooks, Robert Penn Warren. Now, most of these names will be very, very familiar to you, because we are going to be studying them in detail in this course. And New Historicism, okay, what it does is it examines a text by also examining other texts of the same time period. You have people like Stephen Greenblatt, Louis Montrose, Jonathan Goldberg, H. Aram Visir, who follow this school of theory. Now it comes down to postcolonialism. Now, what postcolonialism does, it focuses on the influences of colonialism in literature, especially regarding the historical conflict resulting from the exploitation of less developed countries and indigenous people by Western nations. And you have Edward Said, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and Declan Kibbard, who are the main supporters of postcolonial theory. Now, postmodernism is the criticism of the conditions present in the 20th century, often with concern for those viewed as social deviants or the other. And here we have Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari, and Maurice Blanchard. Then we come down to post-structuralism. Now, what is post-structuralism? Post-structuralism is the general attempt to contest and subvert structuralism and to formulate new theories regarding interpretation and meanings, initiated particularly by deconstructors, but as also associated with certain aspects and practitioners of psychoanalytical, Marxist, cultural feminist, and gender criticism. Now, post-structuralism, which arose in the late 1960s, includes such a wide variety of perspectives that no unified post-structuralist theory can actually be identified. Rather, post-structuralists are distinguished from other contemporary critics by their opposition to structuralism and by certain concepts that they embrace. Now, Structuralism is also a catch-all term for various theoretical approaches, such as deconstruction, that criticize or go beyond structuralism's aspirations to create a rational science of culture by extrapolating the model of linguistics to other discursive and aesthetic formations. And the chief propounders of post-structuralism are Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, and Julia Kristeva. Now, for psychoanalytical literary criticism, or the theory of psychoanalysis, what it does is it explores the role of the subconscious in literature, including that of the author, the reader, and the characters in the text. And you have people like Sigmund Freud, Jacques Lacan, Slavoj Žižek, and Viktor Tausk. Then you have queer theory, which examines, questions, and criticizes the role of gender identity and sexuality in literature. And people associated with the queer theory are Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, and Michel Foucault. Then you have the reader response theory, which focuses upon the active response of the reader to a text. And you have Louise Rosenblatt, Wolfgang Iser, Norman Holland, Hans Robert Joasch, Stuart Hall, who are the proponents of the reader response theory. And then we have Russian formalism. Now, what is Russian formalism? Russian formalism is a school of literary criticism that originated during World War I. It flourished in the 1920s in the former Soviet Union, and the practitioners of Russian formalism, they focused on the form of literary works. The school met with a great deal of opposition, particularly at its inception, and the term formalism was actually used by critics of the school to deride its elevation of form over content. So for the Russian formalists, form was much more important than what was actually in the text or the content or the matter. And they were often opposed and derided because they chose to place form at a higher level. Now, Russian formalists argued that literary language has a very special function to perform, and that function was to reinvigorate language and to redeem it from the insipid and vapid state into which it had sunk under the weight of everyday usage. They thus viewed literary language as fundamentally different from everyday speech, which serves simply to communicate information. So what they were trying to say is that everyday speech cannot be considered to be literary language, and literary language is very different from everyday speech, because everyday speech simply communicates information. Okay? They believed that literariness, by virtue of its capacity to overturn common and expected patterns of grammar, of storyline, could rejuvenate language. Using language in novel ways could, according to these critics, free readers to experience not only words but even the world in an entirely new way. So that was what Russian formalists and largely the followers of the school of formalism believed in. Okay? And the main proponents of Russian formalism were Viktor Shklovsky and Vladimir Pop. Now, coming down to the structuralism and semiotics, what it does is it examines the underlying structures in a text, the linguistic units in a text, and how the author conveys meaning through such structures or any such structure. So basically what they're looking at is the substructure of a text and how meaning is conveyed, or how the author makes sense out of the structures. And structuralism, if we take it a little further, or if I expand on what it is a science of humankind which was born in the theories of the structuralist anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss and the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Now, Lévi-Strauss, who studied everything from the structure of villages to myths, looked for recurring and common elements that transcended the differences within and among cultures. Saussure founded semiology, a science of signs, and argued that any sign is composed of two parts, a signifier, which is the sound image, and a signified or the abstract concept that is represented by the signifier. Now, using Saussure's linguistic theory as a model and employing semiotic theory, a text or other signifying a semiotic theory, structuralists claim that it is possible to analyze a text or other signifying structure systematically, even scientifically, to reveal the grammar, in quotes, behind its form and meaning. So, using Saussure's linguistic theory, which has two parts, basically a signifier, and which is a sign that has two parts, which is basically a signifier or the sound image, and the signified or the abstract concept that is represented by the signifier. What a structuralist would do is analyze a text and or other signifying structures very, very systematically, very, very scientifically, in an attempt to reveal the hidden grammar behind the form and the meaning of these structures. And the chief people who followed this particular theory were Ferdinand de Saussure, Ramon Jacobson, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Roland Barthes, Mikhail Bakhtin, George Lotman, Antti Arne, and even the morphology of folklore. Now, eco-criticism is another school that needs to be looked at very, very briefly. What it does is it explores cultural connections and human relationships to the natural world. Okay, and the theorists, some other theorists are Robert Graves, Alamgir Hashmi, John Sutherland, Nota Fry, Leslie Fiedler, Kenneth Burke, Paul Benicio, and Barbara Johnson. Now, today, essentially what I was trying to do and what we did was basically give you an overview of what is literary theory. What do we understand by the term? Okay, how it came to be, how it came to use, how it has come to stay, and how it is a part of our lives, particularly for us, those who study literature. We began by saying that literary theory, in a very, very strict sense, is nothing but the systematic study of the nature of literature and of the methods of analyzing literature. And we also said that since the 19th century, literary theory has often included, if not in addition to, instead of theory per se, considerations of intellectual history, moral philosophy, social prophecy, and other interdisciplinary themes. So in the humanities particularly, what we concluded was that the latter style of scholarship is often simply called theory, and as a consequence, the word theory itself has become an umbrella term for a variety of scholarly approaches to reading texts or to literature, and most of these approaches are informed by various strands of continental philosophy. And we also said that for some theorists, contemporary theorists and literary scholars, literature cannot be defined, okay, and while others say that it refers to the use of any use of language, but you have to also keep in mind that specific theories are distinguished not only by their methods and their conclusions, but even by how they define a text or their idea of a text. So, and then we went on to say that for some, a text is a literary text, whereas for others, it could contain everything and anything under the sun, from fiction, non-fiction, popular fiction, film, historical documents, law, advertising. It could include anything that comes under the wide range of cultural studies. And we also said that as far as scholars of cultural studies were concerned, some of them look at cultural events such as a fashion show or a football riot as texts waiting to be interpreted. So basically what we are saying, going by this, is that literary theory as such can be thought of as the general theory of interpretation. And then we also laid emphasis on the point that literary theory or theorists of literature, they draw on a very, very heterogeneous tradition of continental philosophy and the philosophy of language. So any classification of the approach is actually just very, very approximate, and there are many schools of or types of literary theory which takes many different approaches to understanding texts. And most theories, what they do is they combine different methods or different approaches for understanding a particular text. And we gave the example of Paul de Man. Then we looked at some of the main and historically important schools of theory such as New Criticism, Formalism, Russian Formalism, and Structuralism, PostStructuralism, Marxism, Feminism, and French Feminism, Christian, PostColonialism, New Historicism, Deconstruction, Reader Response Criticism, and Psychoanalytical Criticism. And then we looked very, very briefly at the history of literary theory, which, as I said earlier, goes as far back as to ancient Greece and ancient Rome with the works of Aristotle, Horace, and Longinus and Horace. But here today we are just giving you names of authors. We are just mentioning very, very briefly what these different schools of theory are. But as we meet again in our future discussions, we will be looking at each theory critically and in our next lecture in A to Z. Thank you.